So now we're going to complete our color wheel. And the question becomes, what goes in the middle? Well, let's take a look. If you take a look, you'll see that we have in the middle of the color wheel something called neutral gray. Some of you might be surprised to see this because you've been used to mixing colors together and winding up with brown, not gray. Well, that's because the colors that you've been using aren't tuned exactly right. But on the color wheel and in certain paint sets, when you mix colors that are opposite on the color wheel, you will actually get a very nice, warm, neutral gray. Now, what are we talking about? Opposites on the color wheel are called complementary colors, and we need to spell that correctly. Complementary. Notice that E there. If we say, "Oh, you look lovely today," that's spelled with an I. Complementary means opposite. Opposites on the color wheel are color wheel colors that lie exactly across from one another. So the Christmas colors of red and green that are exactly across from one another, right through the middle like the spokes of a wheel, those are complementary colors. If we take red and green and we start mixing them together and they're tuned correctly, we will get neutral gray. Neutral gray is not a color. Neutral gray is a neutral. White is a neutral. Black is a neutral. Brown is a neutral. They are not considered colors. So the next time you see white, black, brown, gray, remember that we are not talking about a hue. Now, while we're at it, let's discuss that word that I just said. Hue is another name for color. So, red is a hue, green is a hue, blue is a hue, yellow-green is a hue. Hue means color. And color has many different aspects, which we'll discuss later on. The thing that you need to know is that any colors which are opposite one another, directly opposite one another on the color wheel, mixed together in approximately even amounts, will get you neutral gray, assuming, of course, that the colors are mixed properly. Now, one last thing. When you take a look at the color wheel, you'll remember that we discussed to make a tertiary color, we needed to mix a primary with a neighboring secondary. So when we mixed yellow, which is the primary, with a neighboring secondary green, that's how we wound up with yellow-green. But now, what happens when we mix a primary with a non-neighboring secondary? Can you figure out the answer to that? I'll give you a second. What happens when we mix a primary with a non-neighboring secondary? Well, let's try and reason this out. Primary yellow has two neighbors. The two neighbors, which are secondary colors, are green and orange. So the two neighbors are not going to be used. So what can we use that is a secondary, but not neighboring yellow? The answer, of course, is violet. So what happens when we mix a color like yellow with a non-neighboring secondary? The answer is we get neutral gray. A primary mixed with a non-neighboring secondary will give you neutral gray. Let's try that again. Let's take a look at blue. What do we get when we mix blue with a non-neighboring secondary? Well, the neighbors to blue that are secondaries are once again green and violet. So what secondary is left? The answer, of course, is orange. And what happens when we mix blue and orange? You guessed it. Once again, neutral gray. Please go on to part 6.